What would you do if you saw a hungry child outside in the freezing cold? Would you offer help or walk away? Sarah Harris made a simple, life-changing decision that led her to a new beginning. But who was the mysterious man who changed everything for her? How did a small act of kindness lead to an opportunity that could change her life forever? Find out in this inspiring story, only here on TH Voices of the Underdog. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It was a bitterly cold winter evening in the small, forgotten town of Silver Creek, nestled in the northern reaches of New York. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the seasons blended into one another, and people went about their daily lives without much fuss. A town where not much changed, and everything seemed to remain the same, especially for Sarah Harris, who had lived here her entire life. The snowstorm outside had been relentless, the wind howling like an angry wolf against the windows of Riverside Grill, the one and only diner in town. The diner, though small and unassuming, had a warmth about it, both in temperature and in spirit. Its walls were lined with checkered tiles, its booths were made of worn red leather, and the counter was polished to a dull shine. Neon signs outside flickered intermittently, barely visible through the thick, swirling snow, advertising fresh coffee and homemade pie. To the locals, Riverside Grill was more than just a place to eat. It was a small piece of familiarity, a home away from home. The regulars came and went, chattering about their days, sharing stories, and finding comfort in each other's company. For Sarah, it was the only job she had, the only job she could hold on to in the town where nothing ever seemed to change. Sarah was 32 years old, with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and eyes that always seemed a little too tired for someone her age. She had worked at Riverside Grill for almost 5 years, serving up plates of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and the famous apple pie that everyone raved about. The work was exhausting, the hours long, and the tips inconsistent. But Sarah didn't mind. She had bills to pay, a son to raise, and dreams that felt as distant as the mountains on the horizon. Her son, Jake, was 10 years old, a bright-eyed boy with a love for science and an imagination that could take him to far-off places. He lived with her mother, her elderly mother who had helped raise him while Sarah juggled shifts at the diner and her own personal struggles. On most nights, Sarah would return home late, after the diner had closed, to a quiet apartment and the sound of her mother's soft voice calling from the other room, asking about her day. It wasn't much, but it was their life, and it was all she could manage. She'd slip into bed, knowing Jake would be up early the next morning, eager to head to school. Her dreams of opening a bakery or running a small cafe seemed far away, almost impossible, given the grind of day-to-day survival. She didn't have the luxury of thinking about anything beyond the next paycheck. That evening, as Sarah moved between tables, refilling coffee mugs and clearing plates, the diner seemed quieter than usual. The regular chatter, the hum of voices filling the air, was replaced by the steady drone of the overhead fluorescent lights. It was as if the diner itself had taken a breath and settled into a heavy stillness. Sarah paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked around. The usual mix of truckers, farmers, and locals that passed through had thinned out. Only a few patrons remained, quietly finishing their meals or sipping their coffee in the corner booths. She moved toward the window to clear a table, her breath fogging the glass as she wiped it clean. The wind outside was relentless, howling against the window in an eerie, mournful song. She caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A small figure standing just outside the diner, hunched against the cold. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was a boy. No older than 10 years old, standing in the dark, empty parking lot, his clothes ragged and torn. His jacket hung loosely around his shoulders, far too big for him, and his sneakers looked like they'd seen better days, dirty, worn, and barely holding together. His small hands were tucked into his sleeves, trying in vain to shield himself from the bitter wind. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Sarah could see the faint outline of his eyes, staring longingly through the window into the warm glow of the diner. She paused, her breath caught in her throat. The boy didn't appear to be causing trouble. He wasn't asking for anything, but there was something about him, something that tugged at her heart. He stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something, anything. Sarah swallowed hard, a tight knot forming in her chest. She knew that feeling. The feeling of being lost, of waiting for something to happen, of hoping for a change. The door to the diner jingled and Sarah turned quickly, snapping back to reality. Mr. Peterson, the local mechanic, walked in with his usual scowl and a half-hearted greeting. He shuffled past her, his boots clomping on the tile floor as he settled into his usual spot at the counter. Sarah grabbed the coffee pot, moving toward him as she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in her chest. She poured his coffee with a practiced motion, trying not to let her thoughts wander back to the boy outside. "You okay, Sarah?" Mr. Peterson asked, looking at her with a raised eyebrow. "Yeah, just tired," she said, forcing a smile. "Long day." "Same here," he muttered, stirring his coffee. "Nothing but work in the cold, you know how it is." Sarah nodded absently, her mind still on the boy outside. She glanced over her shoulder again, but he was still there, standing at the edge of the parking lot. His face was now visible, pale and thin, a child's face hardened by something Sarah couldn't quite place. She felt a deep pang of sympathy for him, but more than that, an overwhelming need to help. She couldn't stand the thought of him out there, alone and cold. "Been out there for a while," Sarah muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. Her co-worker, Jenny, came up beside her, following her gaze. Jenny was a little younger, around 25, with short blonde hair and a carefree attitude that Sarah both admired and envied. Jenny shrugged when she saw the boy. "Yeah, we get a few like that now and then," Jenny said, wiping down a table. "Kids who run away or just don't have anywhere else to go. If he comes in, fine, but you can't save everyone, Sarah." Sarah frowned. It wasn't about saving anyone, it was about doing the right thing. This was a child, and he was out there alone in the cold. Her heart ached with the thought of him standing there waiting for something. "I know," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, trying to focus. "But he's just a kid. He shouldn't be out there." Jenny gave her a doubtful look, then shrugged and went back to her duties, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. She knew she had to do something. She wasn't sure what, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She grabbed a clean plate, wiping it quickly with a cloth, and headed toward the kitchen. She didn't have much to offer, but she could at least make sure he didn't go to bed hungry tonight. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the cold as she ladled out a generous serving of the day's special meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, adding a warm roll on the side. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that could make a difference. As she stepped toward the door, her boss, Ron, eyed her with suspicion. "What's that for?" he grumbled, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Customer didn't like their order," Sarah lied smoothly, giving him a casual smile. "I'm just tossing it out." Ron grunted in response, barely acknowledging her. Sarah took the plate and stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin as she made her way toward the boy. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, startled, his wide eyes darting between her and the plate she was holding. "Hey, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, crouching down to his level. "You look hungry. This is for you." The boy hesitated, his small hands clenched at his sides. He looked like he was about to say something, but no words came. Sarah offered the plate again, this time a little closer. Her heart broke seeing him so hesitant, so uncertain. "It's okay," she reassured him, her voice gentle. "You don't have to say anything. Just take it." The boy's fingers trembled as they reached out, slowly, cautiously, taking the plate from her hands as if it might disappear. He didn't say anything, but his eyes filled with silent gratitude, eyes that spoke volumes about the pain he was carrying. Without a word, he clutched the plate to his chest and took a step back, retreating into the shadows. "You can eat inside," Sarah offered softly, "where it's warm." But the boy shook his head quickly, not wanting to enter the diner. He retreated further into the darkness, his small figure vanishing into the night. Sarah stood there for a moment, watching him disappear. She felt a heavy sadness in her chest, mixed with a strange sense of relief. At least he wouldn't go to bed hungry tonight. She wished she could do more, but that was all she could offer for now. As she turned to go back inside, she didn't realize that someone had been watching the entire interaction from the far corner of the diner. Sarah Harris had never considered herself a particularly sentimental person. Life had a way of stripping people of such luxuries, she thought. But as she stood at the window, wiping down the tables, the image of the boy outside refused to leave her mind. Every time she glanced outside, he was still there, standing motionless in the cold. His small body was hunched against the wind, and despite the storm that seemed to swallow the night, he didn't budge. He didn't come in, he didn't knock, he didn't call for attention. He simply stared longingly, silently, into the warm, inviting space of the riverside grill. She hadn't expected to feel so unsettled. Maybe it was the way he looked, or perhaps it was the silent plea in his eyes. But something tugged at her, a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. There were so many people who passed through the diner each day, some who needed help, some who barely seemed to acknowledge the world around them. She'd grown used to it, but this was different. This was a child, standing alone in the cold, his body small and fragile against the vastness of the storm. She glanced across the diner again. The usual hum of activity had slowed, replaced by the occasional clink of silverware against plates. The only customers left were the regulars, Mr. Peterson still sipping his coffee in the corner and a couple of truckers talking quietly among themselves. No one seemed to notice the boy outside, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone should. She should. Her mind raced. She barely had enough money to cover her own bills, much less give charity to a stranger. Her paycheck didn't stretch far enough to buy luxuries like extra food or donations. But the thought of that child standing alone, exposed to the elements, gnawed at her. It was too much for her to ignore. She had to do something, even if it meant scraping together what little she could. "Sarah," a voice broke her train of thought. It was Jenny, her co-worker, moving toward her with a tray of dirty dishes in hand. "You okay?" Sarah blinked, shaking herself from the strange sense of heaviness that had settled in her chest. She hadn't even realized how long she had been standing there, staring outside. "Yeah, just thinking," Sarah murmured, not quite sure how to explain the way she was feeling. "Thinking," Jenny raised an eyebrow. "It's a cold one out there tonight. Maybe you need a hot cup of coffee." She set the tray on the counter and turned to grab a rag, wiping down the edge of the counter. "You've been working non-stop. Maybe you should take a break." "I'm fine," Sarah replied quickly, giving Jenny a small, tight smile. "I'll be okay." But Jenny wasn't convinced. She looked over her shoulder at Sarah, then back outside. "You know, if he wants something to eat, it's not our job to give it to him." "I know," Sarah said softly, but the words barely registered in her mind. Her eyes were once again drawn to the boy. Jenny sighed and shook her head. "Well, whatever you decide, just be careful. Not everyone out there is looking for help. Some of them want something else." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to argue or explain. The truth was, she wasn't sure why she felt so strongly about this boy, but it wasn't a choice anymore. She knew she had to do something. Sarah felt the familiar weight of her apron against her waist as she grabbed a clean plate from the stack on the counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed it down, then quickly ladled a generous serving of the day's special, beef stew, roasted potatoes and vegetables, onto the plate. The rich aroma of the beef stew filled the air, comforting and warm. She added a slice of fresh, warm bread on the side, carefully stacking it all together. It was far from a five-star meal, but it was filling, and that was all she could offer. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed the plate, tucking it under her arm. The cold outside rushed at her as soon as the door swung open, a sharp gust of wind biting through the thin fabric of her uniform. She pulled the collar of her jacket tighter around her neck and stepped out into the parking lot, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The boy was still standing there, his back to her now, but she could see the faint outline of his shoulders shivering in the wind. He was so small, so vulnerable. "Hey," Sarah called gently, her voice soft, unsure. She didn't want to startle him, but she needed to get his attention. She didn't know what to expect, whether he would run or shout or just ignore her completely. She'd seen plenty of people pass by in the night, people who ignored others in need, people who dismissed the idea of helping altogether. But this felt different. The boy stiffened, turning slowly as Sarah approached. His face was thinner than she had first realized, pale and drawn, with eyes that looked far older than a child's should. He didn't speak, just stood there studying her with a wary gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah's breath was visible in the cold air, her hands trembling as she held the plate in front of her like an offering. "Are you hungry?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy didn't answer, but Sarah could see his eyes flicking toward the food. His thin lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak, but then stopped himself. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, and his posture was defensive, as though he was ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Sarah stepped closer, feeling the sting of the cold on her cheeks. She lowered the plate slightly, her voice warm but firm. "It's okay. You don't have to say anything, just take it, it's for you." The boy hesitated, and Sarah almost thought he might turn and run. But after what felt like an eternity, his trembling hand reached out, barely touching the plate before closing around it. He didn't say thank you, didn't acknowledge her at all, but Sarah saw it in his eyes, something like gratitude, something that made her chest tighten. Without another word, the boy turned and in one swift motion began walking away. He didn't look back, didn't even glance over his shoulder. He just walked into the night, the plate clutched tightly in his hands, vanishing into the shadows of the alley. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, watching him disappear into the storm. She wanted to call after him, ask him where he was going, why he was out here, but she didn't. She knew it wasn't her place to ask. It was like he was just another lost soul wandering through the cold night, waiting for something to change, something to offer him hope. She turned slowly and walked back into the diner, her heart heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It wasn't relief, it wasn't satisfaction. It was confusion, regret. What if she had done more? What if he needed more than just a meal? But she couldn't chase after him. She didn't know what else she could have done. As she re-entered the warmth of the diner, the sounds of quiet chatter and clinking silverware returned to her senses. She placed the empty plate in the sink, her movements mechanical. Jenny glanced at her as she passed. "Did he take it?" Jenny asked. "Yeah," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible. "He took it." She didn't know if she'd done the right thing, if her small act of kindness would mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But for that brief moment, she had given something. She had shared a piece of warmth, a piece of herself with a boy who needed it. The door to Riverside Grill swung open again, and Sarah stepped back inside, feeling the warmth envelop her after the icy cold outside. The boy was gone, swallowed by the night, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't done enough. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart heavy, as the sounds of the diner slowly filled the air again. The clink of silverware, the hum of conversation. As she made her way back behind the counter, Her eyes flicked to the far corner of the room, where a man sat alone in a booth. He had been there for a while, she realized, his presence somehow unnoticed until now. He was well dressed, a dark coat draped over his shoulders, a pressed shirt underneath, and polished shoes that gleamed even in the dim light of the diner. His demeanor was calm, composed, as if he belonged to a world far removed from the humble, worn walls of Riverside Grill. Sarah moved quickly, trying to avoid looking at him again, but as she placed a coffee mug in front of one of the regulars, her eyes wandered back. The man hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't touched his food or looked up from his phone. But there was something about him that stood out, a quiet intensity, a sense of observation that felt almost too deliberate. She tried to push the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. The last thing she wanted was to be bothered by some stranger in a small diner. But just as she was about to take another order, she felt his gaze on her. His dark eyes were fixed on hers, steady and unwavering. "Excuse me," the man's voice broke through the hum of the diner, low and measured. "Can I get a coffee? Black, please." Startled, Sarah nodded, gathering herself before moving to the coffee pot. His eyes were still on her, but he didn't speak again. She poured the coffee, trying to steady her hands, and placed the cup in front of him without saying a word. The man took a sip, then set the cup down with a slight tilt of his head. "That's some rare kindness you showed out there," he said suddenly, his voice warm but direct. Sarah blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, unsure of where the conversation was going. "The boy," he continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "I saw what you did. It wasn't much, but it was everything to him. You didn't have to do it, but you did anyway. That's rare." Sarah fidgeted with the edge of her apron, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "It wasn't anything. Just food," she replied quickly, trying to downplay the gesture. "Most people would have ignored him. Most people would have kept going, pretending they didn't see," the man said, leaning slightly forward. "But you didn't. That's why I noticed. People like you are rare." Sarah didn't know how to respond. Her instinct was to brush it off, but there was something about the man's tone, so sincere, so sure, that made her feel uneasy. "I just thought he needed it," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't think much about it." The man's expression softened slightly, his voice becoming gentler. "You see, that's the difference. You didn't think about it. You just did it. That's what makes it so powerful." For a moment, Sarah was silent, unsure how to process his words. She wasn't used to being the center of anyone's attention, let alone receiving praise for something as simple as giving food to a hungry child. It made her uncomfortable. The man took another sip of his coffee before setting the cup down, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You're not like the others. You might not see it now, but you've got something rare, something worth protecting." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, not sure where this conversation was going. "I'm just doing what I can," she muttered, trying to avoid the pressure of his gaze. The man watched her for a long moment, as if weighing something, before finally speaking again. "My name is Alexander Knight," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "I've been watching you for a while, watching the way you move through life, how you carry yourself, and what I saw today. It struck me." Sarah was taken aback. She hadn't even realized he'd been paying such close attention to her. I didn't know you were watching," she said, her voice faltering. Alexander's smile didn't fade. "I tend to observe more than I speak. People have a way of revealing more about themselves than they think. And what you did for that boy, that says a lot about you." Sarah felt a rush of discomfort, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what to make of him. Why was he here in a diner like this, talking to someone like her? "I've seen a lot in my life," Alexander continued, his tone shifting slightly, "and I can tell when someone has a good heart. What you did today, it's not common. It's a gift. You should know that." Before Sarah could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the counter toward her without a word. Sarah looked at it for a long moment, then glanced up at him, bewildered. "I want you to take this," Alexander said quietly. "You've done something rare today. Consider this my way of paying it forward. You may not realize it, but this world needs more people like you." Sarah stared at the envelope in confusion. She didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of generosity. She had been struggling for so long, just trying to make ends meet, and now, here was a stranger offering her something she didn't feel she deserved. "I can't," she began, shaking her head, but Alexander held up his hand to stop her. "You can," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You deserve it. Don't worry about it now. Just know that I've been where you are. And kindness, like yours, should never go unnoticed." With that, he stood up, leaving the envelope on the counter in front of her. "I'll leave you to it," he said, giving her a final nod before turning to walk out of the diner. Sarah stood still, her heart racing as she looked down at the envelope. She had no idea what was inside, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly predict. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought it out, but here it was, a chance, an opportunity. As she picked up the envelope, the weight of it in her hands felt heavier than she expected. Inside, there was something that could change everything. And just like that, everything she thought she knew about her future, her struggle, her dreams, everything, suddenly seemed much more possible. The door to Riverside Grill had barely closed behind Alexander when Sarah turned back toward the counter, still reeling from the unexpected conversation. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, the words he'd spoken lingering in her mind like a weight she couldn't shake off. The warmth of the diner felt foreign now, the hum of the fluorescent lights too loud against the quiet of her thoughts. She'd been working at Riverside Grill for years, serving plates of meatloaf and pouring coffee for strangers, but nothing in her routine had ever felt as heavy as this. The man had left so suddenly, but his presence remained. His gaze, steady and unwavering, had followed her every movement with an intensity that left her feeling exposed in a way she wasn't used to. And then, there was the check. The envelope. The whole strange exchange. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if it had all been a mistake. She moved slowly behind the counter, her fingers lingering over the coffee pot. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, like she was caught in a moment between one world and another. What had just happened? What had Alexander seen in her that had made him do this? She absent-mindedly wiped down the counter, her mind still occupied with his words. Kindness is a rare gift. What did that even mean? She wasn't anyone special. Just a woman trying to get by, just a waitress who did what she could to help others when she could. But now, there was this check, sitting quietly on the counter where he had left it. Something told her to look again. A sudden impulse made her reach for the envelope. She hadn't thought to pick it up before, her attention lost in the confusion of Alexander's departure. But now, with no one else around and the din of the diner settling into a quieter hum, she found herself drawn to it. It had been so carefully placed under his coffee cup, tucked away like a secret she was only just beginning to uncover. Sarah turned it over in her hands, her fingers brushing over the crisp, sealed flap. She hesitated. She could feel the weight of it, the promise, the possibility, the risk. What did it mean? Why had he left her something so significant? She glanced around the diner again, though there was no one left to witness what she was about to do. The few remaining customers were busy with their meals, and Jenny, her co-worker, had gone out for a break. For once, Sarah was alone. With a steady breath, Sarah peeled open the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. As she pulled the contents free, a thick, glossy check slipped out. Her eyes widened as she saw the amount, more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. The figures on the check were bold, stark, and undeniably real. She swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. The check was made out to her, Sarah Harris. It wasn't a donation. It wasn't a charity. It was a gift. Or was it an investment? She wasn't sure. But the sum of money printed there was enough to make her dizzy with disbelief. She quickly glanced down at the letter, which she hadn't yet read. It was neatly folded, the paper a heavier weight than she expected, and she unfolded it with a sense of trepidation. The letter was brief, just a few lines, written in neat, precise handwriting. Kindness is a rare gift. Continue sharing it. The simplicity of the message struck her as much as the check had. It wasn't a plea for anything in return. It wasn't an investment. It wasn't an offer of charity either. It was a recognition of what she had done. And somehow, in Alexander's eyes, it was worth this incredible gesture. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mind trying to process what this meant for her. Was this real? Could she take this money and use it? She could pay off bills, take care of her mother and son, maybe even open that bakery she had always dreamed about. This check, this huge sum of money, could change everything for her, but the confusion still lingered. Why had he given it to her? Why her? She wasn't anyone important. She was just a waitress, stuck in the same routine day after day, trying to make ends meet. She had nothing special about her, just kindness. But was that enough to warrant this? Her thoughts raced as she held the letter in her hand, reading it over and over again. Continue sharing it, it said. Was this some kind of test? Had Alexander been watching her, waiting for a moment to see if she would truly make a difference? She didn't know. She didn't understand why he would do something like this. But the reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, trying to collect her thoughts. She had to make a decision. She could take the check and use it to make a fresh start, or she could refuse it and let this strange encounter slip away. Either way, it felt like she was standing on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But the uncertainty was suffocating. The money could change her life. It could open doors she never thought possible. But was it right to accept it? Was it the right thing to do? Sarah didn't know. She only knew that her heart was racing, and the weight of the check in her hands was both a gift and a challenge. She could almost hear Alexander's words in her mind. Kindness is a rare gift. Was that all this was? A reward for a simple act of kindness? Was she being tested, or was this truly an opportunity? Sarah stood still for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. Her mind swirled with questions. What was she supposed to do with this kind of opportunity? Was she truly worthy of such a gift? And what would it mean for her future if she took it? She glanced around the diner once more, taking in the familiar sights. Empty plates on tables, the worn wood of the booths, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the back. It was all so ordinary, so predictable. And yet tonight everything had shifted. Slowly, Sarah placed the check back into the envelope and slid it into her apron pocket. For now, she would take it, hold on to it, and think. She wasn't ready to make a decision. She needed time. But the idea that her life could be different, that the door she had only dreamed of could be within reach, was enough to keep her heart racing with both fear and excitement. The letter would stay with her for now, a reminder that kindness, even in its simplest form, could lead to unexpected places. And as Sarah stood in the quiet of Riverside Grill, she realized that she wasn't just holding on to the check. She was holding on to a future that had suddenly become far more uncertain, but also infinitely more possible. The days that followed Alexander's visit to Riverside Grill were a blur, a mixture of disbelief and cautious excitement. Sarah had tucked the check into her pocket and buried the letter under a stack of receipts and unpaid bills, not quite ready to process what it all meant. But as the hours stretched into days, something shifted inside her. It was as if the universe had nudged her in a new direction, a path she had longed to follow but never dared to walk. It wasn't just the money, it was the possibility. The chance to finally change her life, to stop working endless shifts for a few extra dollars, to stop scraping by. She had always dreamed of owning a bakery, a small place where the scent of fresh bread would fill the air and where people could feel at home, just as she had hoped. But dreams, in her world, always seemed far out of reach. Now, with Alexander's check in her pocket, the dream felt within her grasp. It was a terrifying thought, but also exhilarating. The fear of failure, of taking a risk so big that it could all fall apart, gnawed at her. But the thought of continuing the same routine, of never reaching for something more, felt suffocating. One night, after closing the diner and returning to her small apartment, Sarah sat in the dim light of her kitchen, staring at the check. The simple message written on the letter echoed in her mind. Kindness is a rare gift. Continue sharing it. It wasn't just a message about giving. It was a reminder that she had the power to change things, not just for herself, but for others. She realized that accepting this gift wasn't just about taking something. It was about passing it forward, using it to create something positive, something that would spread beyond herself. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a new determination. She couldn't wait any longer. She made the decision to take the leap. She handed in her resignation at Riverside Grill, an emotional moment, but one filled with a quiet sense of relief. She had known for so long that her time there was limited, but the fear of change had always held her back. Now, that fear was replaced by something else, the promise of a future she could build for herself and for Jake, her son. The journey wasn't easy, of course. Sarah spent hours researching, meeting with local suppliers and finding a location for her new bakery. It wasn't a large place, but it was perfect for what she had in mind, small and cozy, a place where customers would feel like they were part of a community. With Alexander's financial support, she was able to get the business up and running, and soon, Sweet Treats Bakery was born. At first, it was slow. The bakery didn't attract much attention at first, and Sarah found herself waking up at the crack of dawn to bake fresh batches of bread, cookies, and pastries, hoping someone would walk through the door. But as word spread, things began to change. Regulars started to come in for their morning coffee and croissants. The once quiet bakery began to hum with conversation, and Sarah found herself smiling at the warmth of it all. People enjoyed her food, but it was more than that. They appreciated the effort she put into making her little shop a reflection of who she was, kind, welcoming, and passionate. As Sweet Treats Bakery began to thrive, Sarah started looking for other ways to give back. She knew she couldn't just help herself. She needed to make a difference for the people around her. She reached out to the local food bank, offering to donate leftover baked goods to those who were struggling. She began volunteering at community events, using her growing platform to help raise awareness for local charities and causes. One day, as Sarah was closing up the bakery, she received a phone call that would change everything. The boy she had helped, standing outside the diner that cold winter night, had been found. He was safe. A local foster family had taken him in, and he was getting the care and attention he needed. The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming. She had always wondered what had happened to him, where he had gone after their brief interaction. Now she knew that her small act of kindness had made a difference. He was no longer alone. Sarah cried as she hung up the phone, overwhelmed by the news. It was a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness could have ripple effects, changing lives in ways she could never have imagined. She didn't know how many other people she could help, but she knew that she was on the right path. The boy's story had come full circle, and it was because of that simple act of sharing a plate of food that things had changed for him. In the months that followed, Sarah's life transformed in ways she had never expected. Sweet Treats Bakery flourished, becoming a staple in the community. People came from all around to sample her pastries and enjoy the atmosphere she had created, a space filled with warmth, generosity, and a sense of belonging. Sarah's story was no longer just about her struggle to survive. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could help others. Throughout it all, Alexander remained in touch, quietly supporting Sarah's journey without asking for anything in return. He was never far, always offering advice or resources when needed, but never pushing himself into the spotlight. Sarah learned that his quiet support wasn't about control, it was about trust. He believed in her potential and gave her the space to grow. His belief in her, though unspoken, was a constant source of encouragement. As the bakery's success continued to grow, Sarah became more involved in the community. She organized charity events, hosted baking classes for kids, and used her business as a platform to support local artisans. She realized that her work was about so much more than baking. It was about building a community, about making people feel valued and heard. One afternoon, as Sarah was arranging fresh bouquets of flowers on the counter, a familiar face walked through the door. It was the boy she had helped that cold night, now looking healthier and happier. He was with a woman who introduced herself as his foster mother. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw Sarah, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. "Thank you," the boy said, his voice small but filled with gratitude. "You helped me when no one else did." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she knelt down to meet his gaze. "You're welcome, sweetheart. I'm so glad you're safe." In that moment, everything Sarah had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, felt worth it. She had made a difference, not just in the boy's life, but in the lives of everyone she touched. And the kindness she had shared, the kindness she had received, had created a ripple effect that was larger than she could have ever imagined. Her life had transformed completely. She was no longer just a waitress at Riverside Grill. She was a business owner, a community leader, a symbol of positive change. The bakery was a reflection of everything she had learned, that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, affecting countless lives in ways that would echo far beyond what she could see. And as she looked around at the smiling faces of her customers, the warm glow of Sweet Treats Bakery, and the child who had once been lost but was now safe, she realized that she had created something far bigger than she had ever dreamed, a legacy of kindness, compassion, and community. The future was bright, and it was hers to shape.